There we go.
Great. Good. With that out of the way, we are good to start. Hi, this is Sai. Welcome to quarterfinals of Tabtastic Summer Open 2023. I'll be sharing this round. I have no preferred gender pronouns. Can the panel please introduce themselves?
Alex, she, her, please.
When he, him address the panel, all that arc. Best of luck.
Great. Couple of rules of housekeeping. We'll be keeping time, but we'll only indicate it on chat when you reach the prescribed time limit of 7:15. Speakers are also highly encouraged to keep their own time. Secondly, please be very specific with your PI preferences, whether you like them through chat or through voice, and other speakers are required to respect that. And the third thing, before you start your speech, just let us know what position you're going, what's the name, and you can reveal your preferred gender pronouns if you're comfortable in doing so. And spectators, please refrain from using the chat for anything that's not important. PM, whenever you're ready.
My partner's the PM, and I think he's having some connectivity issues.
No issues. I think we can wait for a couple before they join.
Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't join. Am I good to start?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, cool. Okay. Okay, first some characterization of what this tax looks like, then I'll talk about competitive fairness, why you get better economic stability, and then why you generally get fiscal harmonization. So first, in terms of what this tax looks like, right? I think what it entails is specifically establishing a unified corporate tax that's applicable to all member states. Currently, each country determines its own corporate taxation policy. I think the specific details of this are probably based on legislative discussions and negotiations and determining that single standardized tax rate that applies uniformly. I think the exact rate of this after deliberation would strike probably a balance between things like revenue generation for like treasuries while also remaining competitive internationally and stuff, right? And I think that that's probably just likely given general sort of incentives, right? Why is this probably better than the comparative? I think one, policymakers within the EU probably have to engage in things like extensive dialogue with stakeholders from like different sort of sectors and establish an effective design for this. I think what that means is that you get like better collective decision making when decisions of taxation are made collectively at an EU level. You have representatives from all member states, and that you probably have a broader range of like ideas and perspectives and stuff. But also too, you address things like tax competition. Yeah, I'll take the clarification.
Can you just like pick a number for corporation tax rate and we'll agree with it?
Sure, like I don't know, I have no fucking clue. Like I feel like also like I don't know, like it just like whatever like a standard one that most of the countries would agree on. Like I'm not fucking like in Europe, I don't know. Okay, addressing tax competition, you probably have like countries to engage in harmful like practices that then are able to attract businesses that results in things like race to the bottom. I think a common like tax probably avoids this consequence. Third, in terms of transparency and accountability mechanisms, you probably just have a greater degree of transparency and accountability. In terms of like the discussions that happen, you probably just have like reporting standards that have to be strengthened across borders. You facilitate better monitoring of things like multinational company activities and stuff. Lastly, you mitigate the extent of political influence to a big enough extent. I think that what you have to do then is you individual decisions are subject to things like political pressures and lobbying from certain interest groups that seek preferential treatment at a EU level. This is probably a lot more neutralized. Okay, first thing, and then in terms of competitive fairness, right? I think one, you close loopholes because a common EU corporate tax mitigates this issue by eliminating jurisdictional arbitrage opportunities and ensures that companies have to pay their fair share. What this looks like is things like transfer pricing manipulation and stuff, where like multinational corporations often like have to manipulate trade pricing, and then prices of goods and services are transferred between like subsidiaries and stuff to shift profit to low tax jurisdictions. I think common EU corporate taxes counters this practice by instituting consistent transfer like guidelines to tax havens and shell companies. I think some companies just take advantage of these jurisdictions for like shell companies to channel these profits and artificially avoid higher taxes. With common EU practices, member states can collaborate and identify like ways to avoid these sorts of things, right? I think what this does is it levels the playing field insofar as like equal taxation exists across member states. Smaller domestic businesses probably are able to compete at a much better level with multinationals. What this looks like is you reduce things like tax advantages for multinationals, and currently like they can exploit differences in actual tax codes to their advantage and utilize like these complex structures to minimize their taxes. Puts like domestic businesses at a disadvantage because they don't have the resources or capacity to engage in most of these things. But also what this does is it like artificially like it diminishes these advantages to a significant enough extent, right? Second thing you get is like economic growth and innovation, because when small domestic businesses face fewer hurdles compared to larger multinational growth, you probably just have better like innovation flourishing because you have fairer competition that ensures through like equal taxation, and then smaller enterprises can better compete and thrive alongside these counterparts. Third thing then, in terms of promoting entrepreneurship and business survival, I think a level playing field probably fosters an environment that's conducive to a lot of this entrepreneurship. Smaller businesses are much more likely to survive and flourish when they're not overshadowed with like aggressive taxation policy or like jurisdictional loopholes, which then supports like local like economies within member states and promotes sustainable job opportunities. I think the weighing of this is one, fair competition is probably just important for like ensuring healthy markets and stuff. Second, just distribution of wealth. I think that a level playing field allows for greater distribution of this. And then third, just like social cohesion. When you have smaller domestic businesses, you have a fairer chance to thrive. Second argument then, in terms of economic stability, I think you get one, better fiscal certainty, right? So what a common tax system does is it provides certainty for businesses that operate within multiple countries to know exactly what they owe across borders, right? So what that means is with like better clarity with a unified system across member states, business operating within multiple countries have clear guidelines on tax obligations. They no longer need to navigate like complex and varying national taxation rules. I think this clarity simplifies compliance and reduces like a lot of the ambiguity. Second thing, in terms of predictability, I think a common EU tax probably just allows for more predictable environments by ensuring stability in a lot of these places, and companies can effectively plan these financial strategies without constant concerns. I think the impact of this is you just get better investment confidence because businesses thrive when there's confidence and predictability, when there's stability in a lot of these taxation policies, and a transparent and consistent tax across the EU increases that confidence, which means you get more things like FDI that fuel growth. You also just get better long-term planning because stable tax regulations allow companies to make these decisions with more accuracy, and they can allocate resources better. Lastly, just like reduce compliance costs. The harmonization means that you are streamlining administrative processes so they no longer need to like have like compliance costs across multiple things. I think fiscal certainty holds significant value because of its crucial role in fostering economic stability. I'll take a POI from CEO.
How are you able to have healthy competition except your one-liners of why companies would go to the developing countries in the East, maybe?
Okay, I think you just get better competition because one, like you have better like ability for smaller companies to be able to compete with businesses that don't just like exploit loopholes in like cheaper like taxation countries. Even if they go to developing countries, I think that's fine insofar as like these companies can still survive and thrive within like these within like environments within like Europe themselves. So I think they have comparatively still better like competition, right? Okay, then in terms of how you prevent tax competition, this will also address that. I think member states often like engage in like harmful competition by lowering their rates to attract FDI, and by having uniformity, this like race to the bottom scenario is probably just prevented to a significant extent. How does this happen? Uniform tax rates. So establishing a single standardized tax will then allow for nations to do that. Second, just like harmonized rules, which means that you have like deductions and exemptions and like other aspects of taxation. I think this reduces incentives for companies to exploit those discrepancies. I think from that you get a lot more revenue generation and public trust, but also just like a level playing field and the economic integration from member states that can focus on facilitating a lot of that integration because collaboration becomes more important than undercutting. Last thing then, in terms of harmonization, I think one, you mitigate things like double taxation and like administrative policies that are probably just bad because currently companies face a lot of these regulations, which then reduces administrative burdens and enhances like investment climates and improves things like cross-border trade and resource allocation efficiency and cross-border collaboration, which is so important for entrepreneurs.
Thanking Prime Minister, calling on Leader of our.
Me and Oisín are Irish, and that means that from the moment we're born until the moment we die, we're constantly educated about EU tax policy. We know so much about European Union corporation tax policy. And there's three things I want to do in terms of setup before I tell you the important thing that we learned, which is that different countries are different from one another. And different countries that are different from one another might need different corporation tax policy. So 3 points to set up before I get to that. But I hate to bury the lead, but that's what it is. First thing to say, 21.5%. Let's just go with 21.5%. That's the average in the EU at the moment. It's a fine number. It's probably what they'll average out as. That's what OG said. OG said they'll go for the average, 21.5%. Explicit agreement there. Second thing, tax havens are non-comparative. Not only are they non-comparative because the motion says common EU corporation tax and not common EU corporation tax policy, so it's the rate of corporation tax and not the wider reaching corporation tax policies, but also because the way in which these tax havens happen is unrelated to tax. It's to do with remittances, the ease of money leaving the country. We used to say Ireland, for example, our corporation tax is 12.5%. There's like 6 other countries in the EU with the same corporation tax. The reason why we get that yummy Apple money is because we make it really easy to let money leave our country before it's taxed. So you get money from Ireland that you generate, you send it to the Cayman Islands where they have a 0% corporation tax rate, or like the Isle of Man or Jersey or one of those countries. And then they get their yummy money because they don't have any corporation tax there. So it's non-comparative. But I also don't know how you get companies to agree to close these, or countries to agree to close these loopholes, because like Luxembourg, Malta, Liechtenstein, Ireland, the Netherlands, all these countries, there's a heap of countries in Europe that all agree on this kind of corporation tax policy. So they don't have fiat to say we're going to close all the loopholes. I could just have counter fiat to say our corporation tax policy is really good. They don't have fiat for that. Third thing, I want to just wipe this away because I hate when EU debates get down to this. This will not change Euroscepticism. I just don't think that it will. And the reason it won't change is because who the fuck cares, right? Like, I mean, obviously the reason it doesn't change Euroscepticism is because that comes through populistic routes that happen through other means and have alternative things to grow on, yada, yada, yada. But just, get out of there. Okay, countries are different. 5 ways countries are different that might mean they have different needs in terms of corporation tax. Firstly, the share of your economy that's domestic versus international business or foreign business, which is to say a country like Germany, whose primary industry is domestic, i.e. unlikely to lead to the same degree as an international company or has set up roots and that kind of thing, they can raise their corporation tax rate because businesses are unlikely to leave their headquartered in Germany and have all their businesses within Germany. Whereas a country like Ireland, for example, whose economy is based off of a lot of foreign business like Apple and Google, etc., those companies are much easier to make them leave. So you want to decrease their corporation tax rate to incentivize them to stay. So different countries have different needs in that way, and neither of them are harming each other by having different corporation tax there. Second, countries that have a wider scale of larger companies in their economy versus smaller companies. So a country like Bulgaria, for example, where the majority of the economy is made up of different smaller businesses versus Ireland, where it's made up of different bigger businesses. Smaller businesses are less likely to have the economies of scale necessary to be able to continuously grow while also paying pretty high corporation tax rates. So countries like that, to grow their economy, decrease their corporation tax rate, oftentimes taxing other things instead, right? You can tax other things instead to allow those companies to grow. Whereas a country like Ireland, well, actually Ireland, for example, they have really massive companies. A country like France, right, which is pretty big businesses within it, can leverage a pretty high corporation tax rate because those companies are able to pay that tax and grow because they benefit from economies of scale within them as well. The third thing is the ability to react to shocks. So if I'm a country in Europe that really likes grain and there's a really bad harvest one year in terms of grain or barley or oil or whatever, we don't have a harvest bill, but you know what I mean. I might have a specific shock that's germane to my particular economy. And I might want to react to that by changing the corporation tax rate. And the way you might do that, for example, is you might want to, for example, lower corporation tax so that businesses don't go bust. And therefore, you would have to have way more money being spent on paying people in the economy through things like welfare if they're no longer being employed. So you might want to keep employment by lowering corporation tax to weather out a particular storm. Or alternatively, if your country is experiencing things like inflation or like overheating, so to speak, you might want to increase corporation tax rates to decrease the level of inflation within that country, or just slow down the level of economic growth and get more money now that you're generating more money. So that's how you react to different shocks that are specific to your economy. And note, and this is just a side note here, one of the massive problems with government side is that even if everyone in the EU is broadly speaking in agreement on something, how do you change this? I presume because they didn't tell us that you need a supermajority like you need for all other kinds of decisions within the European Union. So how do you get that when you have everyone in Europe, apart from, say, Ireland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Malta, those kinds of countries, who want to increase their corporation tax rate because they have, I don't know, a good yield that particular year in terms of their economies and want to generate more revenue, or they have, broader speaking, like more leftist movements getting into power in these countries, but other countries don't want to. You can't change these things. So you can't react to shocks, even if they take into account the whole of the European Union, not to mention, of course, the fact that shocks oftentimes manifest differently within different countries. The fourth reason is import versus the degree of your portfolio as an economy that's made up by different things. So if you're a country like France that makes a lot of its revenue from corporation tax, you might want to, I don't know, maybe you want to increase that as a result so you can get as much revenue as possible. But if you're a country that gets a lot of its revenue from things like exports, you might want to lower your income tax, or sorry, your corporation tax, so you can incentivize businesses to come in order to be able to get a lot of money from things like sale of oil and natural resources and that kind of thing. The final thing, the fifth thing, is methods of attraction. I think this is the obvious thing, right? Which is just like, well, maybe if you kept the same corporation tax in Germany as you had in Bulgaria, it might be harder to incentivize companies to go to Bulgaria than Germany, because Germany has more to offer in terms of like higher rates of education, more people speaking English. Ireland has this too as well. Like that's why we've got more businesses than you guys. No, I'm only messing. But you got what I mean, right? It's harder to attract companies if you've got very little else to offer. So if you've got little else to offer, you can lower your corporation tax to incentivize businesses to come in. If you don't, you can increase it and incentivize it through other means. Closing.
When's the last time Slovenia raised its corporate tax rate?
I don't tend to keep up with Slovenia's domestic corporation tax policy, but Ireland raised ours pretty recently, actually. I went up to an EU minimum. But anyways, 4 reasons then why countries are generally speaking pretty good at choosing their corporation tax policy specific to their country. First is the incentive to generate as much revenue as possible and maintain a stable economy is paramount to any country. People vote with their wallets. If they start experiencing bad times, they're likely to vote you out of government. Secondly, you have a degree of technocracy, so the kind of expertise that opening government talks about exists within countries as well. And thirdly, I think that big lobbyists tend to not actually lobby for corporation tax because they avoid it, if you see my framing. But even then, there's a limit on lobbying for these things, because even if you lobby a politician to increase or to decrease corporation tax, if that results in a failing economy, you'll still get voted out of office. There's a necessary limit to those kinds of things as well. And fourthly, I think it's proximate knowledge of the situations of your country that your country is in, and that kind of thing. Which is to say, I know it's not perfect, right? Countries aren't setting their economic policy or the corporation tax policy at like precisely the right level for those kinds of things. But it's better than if you make everyone have the same fucking corporation tax policy for no particular reason as well, because all the things we get out of opening government seem to just be reasons why having a good tax policy is good, ease of business, etc., and that kind of thing. So if we get that, we can get that instead. That's why I'm very proud to stand on the side of the great nation of Ireland, 12.5% forever. Very proud to.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, calling Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I'll take the ayes verbally. And I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. In this speech, I'll be rebuilding my partner's 2 points on competitive fairness and the other thing, but my doc is freezing. Economic stability, and then I'll do refutation to the ideas we heard from opening opposition. The first thing on competitive fairness, the thesis of this argument is that we're able to mitigate loophole issues because we have better jurisdiction arbitrage. And the biggest impact that we get out of this is that countries within the EU themselves stop competing based on taxes and allow the countries that have the most vulnerable tax policies to actually be able to grow and develop due to their tax revenue. I don't think we heard a very sufficient response from this. So let's go over the parts that are really pertinent and important to their case. The first thing is that large businesses still have the ability to commit tax arbitrage, where they just pick and choose to hold their profits in the places with the lowest tax rates in the EU. So this looks like creating competition for lower taxes, which is incredibly harmful for countries that are in the process of developing, but have to sacrifice those developing needs in order to attract more investment because they feel that that's something that's more important for short-term profit, right? But furthermore, it's also a lot harder for small businesses to actually be able to file things like compliance, to be able to pay for things like their administrative burdens. And it's one of the things that significantly harm the ability of small businesses to compete just because they haven't developed the economies of scale to be able to afford that unless they can no longer engage on that market. So, when we have a common European Union corporate tax, that means that small businesses without the means to engage can actually now compete. And it also means you take away the harmful incentive that countries currently have to compete with each other on the basis of tax to attract the biggest corporations. This is really important because it incentivizes even the biggest companies to make investment decisions based on economics and like productivity instead of just tax, where they're more likely to succeed in the long term. So this looks like investing in like countries within the EU that are particularly beneficial to whatever market that the company is part of, right? For example, it looks like taking into account their long-term growth and how the future of that company would fit in. It looks like how much you can contribute to that country's infrastructure and so on. It doesn't only just look like moving to developing countries, which actually like currently happens and also isn't like the biggest delta within this debate. So I think this means it's something that's really good for generally the competitive market within different countries in the European Union. But furthermore, we tell you that this actually specifically helps countries that are comparatively less like developed, I guess, comparing to others like Spain. So allowing them to attract more corporate investment where things are previously lacking due to like less good tax rates and tax infrastructure. When you have this common tax, you take away the perverse incentives of corporations to basically like not address these countries or harm the ability for these countries to compete. And it also helps countries significantly invest in their innovation, which is something that will help them like be able to attract like make future change without harming their ability to actually get corporations to invest in them through this common tax. We think this is something that is really important because it's something that you can't get unless the entire European Union collaborates on this tax policy. That is to say, there's no way to ensure that corporations just naturally set the best policy for themselves in the greater interest of things, because they have the incentive to continuously compete in the short term. So if we have a common European Union tax, that's the only way we can actually get that competitive fairness, allowing companies to compete and taking away the bad competition that currently occurs. What do we hear from opening opposition? They tell us that countries have different taxation needs. For example, some might be smaller businesses heavy, some might have like different abilities to react to shock. We think, and they say, like, for example, if you have less to offer, you can lower the tax. We think the changing of this tax policy doesn't happen as often as OO believe. Like, it's not something that happens like whenever a country needs to react to the shocks that go in through their economy, for example. It's not something that's as useful the way it currently is used in the status quo. The reasons for this is because tax policy requires a lot of administrative burden. That's to say, it requires intensive negotiations, like planning, economists that like disagree on things. We think it's something that takes a long time, first of all, but also is incredibly divisive. So based on what you prioritize more, like your internal development or the corporate like sponsors that you can attract, this is something that's really important. They also tell us that there's like a limit to lobbying, but it's clear that this isn't really happening right now, right? Given the strong incentives for lobbyists to bring those taxes down and the fact that it's in most cases like working pretty well. So I think like, sure, there might be some limit, but that limit isn't enough to prevent the bad impacts that come from increased tax competitions. And that's something that's been incredibly harmful to many countries within the EU. But furthermore, when we have a common EU tax, we probably pick a tax rate that is consistent enough. And second, have more investment and development that is able to counteract these different taxation needs. And also, we mitigate for the fact that countries don't have the incentive to develop sustainably currently. So with this common tax, you're likely to be able to have a common policy that acts in the interests of all of these countries, which is something that's really good. The last argument that we bring to you is on economic stability and more fiscal certainty. And we think we're able to get much more fiscal certainty with more clarity and obligations. So this is the reason that we're able to get better investment and development for countries in the EU that currently isn't happening right now when they only have like individual taxes. The first part of this is that so much administration works and tax dollars are just like lost through instability and bureaucracy, especially since where there is uncertainty, consumer spending decreases and companies have the active incentive to find loopholes, jack up compliance costs, so on. Second, we do things like mitigate double taxation just to make that environment much more friendly for small businesses and make it more friendly to people that are actually seeking to innovate and create new developments within these countries to fund their activities, to build infrastructure, so on. When we have this, it's something that's super beneficial because it also spills into a couple of really important impacts. The first of which is things like improving cross-border trades, right? So when you promote cross-border trade between member states, companies engaged in international trade no longer have to face those challenges. Yeah.
Why do we care for small businesses which produce at higher costs, hire less people, have less experience compared to the big corporations that can afford to do innovation as opposed to the small one?
I guess this is just like the classic argument for competition, which is that when there are lots of big companies and when they take over industries in certain countries, they're able to jack up the prices and have worse standards for, their products, like the labor that they hire, so on. So I think when we have more small companies, we can also have more innovation and more ability to look into like newer products, newer industries, more ability to also compete in the existing industries with the big companies that are there. This means better welfare for the citizens of the country. But back to like double taxation and its problems, when we're able to remove barriers associated with like exceptional taxes or like double taxes, you're able to streamline trade procedures, and it has like smoother transactions among EU nations, which is really important for their cross-border harmony and just like strengthening the EU overall. Obviously, it's not going to fix all of the problems, but it can definitely mitigate like the disparities that currently exist in these countries due to taxes. But furthermore, we're also able to do things like incentivize resource allocation efficiency, right? So allowing corporations to allocate their resources in the most efficient way rather than just thinking about tax. For these reasons, we have a better economic space we're really proud to propose.
Thanking Deputy Prime Minister, calling Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Just checking that I'm audible and stuff.
Yep, you are.
Cool. POIs in chat, please. I'll try and take two. The song which Dylan and I's team name references is called Into Deep by Sum 41. The first three lines of that song goes as follows. It's faster, we're falling, we're stopping and stalling, we're running in circles again. And funnily enough, that bears many resemblances to what would happen to the European Union in a world where it has common tax. As Dylan already tells you, it'll likely be extraordinarily sticky. It is difficult to move. It is not very malleable. Even before we get on to all of the stuff that Dylan told you about why it's really important, you know, the different countries are different. Just that even if something happens, a shock that affects like every country within the European Union, and as such, one of the potential tools that could be used in this case is to change the corporate tax. Given that opening government weren't really able to tell you an amount, we gave you an amount, but it's kind of by the by. When you've 27 member states with competing incentives, trying to change this one thing that is probably massive, is very fundamental to each and every different economy, and also noting that the kinds of shocks that are global and widespread in nature, these problems themselves are wicked, they're complex, they're adaptive. Not everyone knows the right answers straight away. We would say that at this particular point, not being able to make any change at all, but even then that change having to come to a consensus of based off of all of those differences, I just don't think it's going to end well. I think it's going to be pretty bad for all of the reasons that Dylan talked about in terms of why it is the case that these countries are different, which, you know, not very complicated. Just one thing to flag before I get into some responses versus opening government. We're not reliant on countries individually changing their corporate tax frequently or doing it all of the time. Noting again, for all of the reasons that they're different, like it mightn't necessarily be the case that they need to do it very often. The economic makeup of any one country is probably not going to change a lot over like this, like the space of 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years. They don't change all that much very quickly, except for maybe in the case of like literally probably just like Ireland and Greece and Portugal, who like do big booms and busts. I don't think most of Europe changes so drastically in such a way that it's necessary to make massive changes to the corporate tax all of the time. We're not reliant on countries actually doing that. But note, like, this debate does take place in the real world. Empirically, there are many different reasons that like the countries do have their own tax rates, and they do benefit from them in all of the ways that Dylan talks about. Just a couple of responses to opening government. Actually, do closing government have anything? Okay. A couple of notes on opening government. I think probably the best thing that they say, or the best proven thing, is this idea of compliance. That is to say that when companies exist across multiple states within the European Union, you add a lot of costs to comply to tax regulations. Therefore, when there's a single rate, it is much easier to comply with all of them. Two responses to this. Firstly, taxes are still collected by the state that you're in. It isn't collected by the European Union just because it exists within the within the European Union tax rate doesn't mean that it's collected by the European Union. That is to say that like the forms that you have to fill in, the rules that you have to follow are still largely going to be the same. Note as well that in most of these states, just the corporate taxes that you have to pay, you're still paying local rates, you're still paying employer contribution rates calculated on the salaries that you're paying to your staff as well. I just don't think there's much of a comparative here. I'm very sorry. Closing government.
Just in case I missed it, what's the impact of flexibility when your case happened in this?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, what is the impact of flexibility when each country gets to decide like their individual corporate tax rate?
The impact of flexibility is that countries don't completely collapse when they're facing individual shocks. Note, even if it's the case that the trigger for that shock is external and affects many countries, note that the makeup of all of these different countries, given like all of the different ways that Dylan proves how these countries are different, means that they need to be able to do this in a way that is adaptive. Even if it's the case that like the response to that is not changing the corporation tax, note that this simply just could be the answer for one country and not for another. All of this is to say that, and also this is particularly important when I get on to the weighing. I think kind of I can do both together here. Firstly, in terms of scale, noting that a flat rate does affect everyone in the European Union. This is really important because you are affecting everyone, albeit in different ways, sometimes much more, sometimes much less. Note as well within the European Union, both in terms of like in terms of grants, but also in terms of like loans and things like this, that you need some countries to still be in good shape to uplift the other ones if it's the case that some others are facing bad times that they can't just fix by changing their corporate tax and all of these things. That is to say, if Germany and France are still making money in spite of a shock, that means for countries like Bulgaria and Croatia, if they've faced the shock in a different way that's affected them in a way that is worse, they can still be uplifted when countries like Germany and France are still doing okay. The inverse is also true to a certain extent, albeit like depending on which countries, they may be better or worse able to do this depending on how much money they make. That is to say, this affects everyone really, really bad. But it's also particularly important for like countries that don't have that much the ones that are particularly vulnerable. That is the ones whose portfolio is made up in a massive amount, like the proportion of tax revenue that they get, if a lot of that is coming from businesses directly through corporation tax, and they don't have many other ways to solve for problems that exist within their economy, they're probably particularly vulnerable because there are a few other ways that they can mitigate against the harms that could come out as a result of this. But also, let's think about certainty here. Note that, again, we're to the extent that we're not bound to any specific rate, it is all of these harms simply accrue as a result of the rate being the flat. That is all that matters. That is all we need for our case to accrue. The shock could come today, it could come in 20 years' time. In any event, it'd be substantially worse as a result of all of those things that we've just said. Look, it's going to be sticky, it's not going to be malleable, it's not being done by the people who are best able to figure out what is the likely best step to be done in any of these situations. It is difficult to access a supermajority. Different countries, indeed, are just different. There's nothing too complicated about this. For all of these reasons, stand with opening opposition.
Thanking Deputy Leader of Opposition, calling upon Member of COG.
Can you guys hear and see me?
Yep, perfectly so.
Amazing. POIs in chat, I'll try and take OO because they're nice and they took us. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Little struggling EU states scurry to us like rats because of the flexibility of the policies that we're able to introduce. Two very simple extensions from closing government. One, why is this likely to be done well in such a way that allows for taxation revenues to come in? And second, why the EU only has the capacity to be able to execute such a taxation policy, which is important for nations like Slovakia or Bulgaria or Estonia, who otherwise will not be able to have the competitive advantages of having these kinds of countries involved. So first, why is this done well? In absence of this analysis, note very carefully, I am not sure why increasing corporate taxes across the entire EU will not massively disincentivize investment into countries like Bulgaria or Latvia or Lithuania, and why it's unlikely that big countries big companies are going to pull out of these places. And in absence of this analysis, it's really unclear why opening government's able to have an impact. So now we're going to prove that. We don't really care exactly what the rate is, but what we're going to prove to you is that it'll be a good rate that will not create capital flight. Here's two significant reasons for this. The first one is that all of the EU suffers if countries like Bulgaria lose investment. It means that, for example, Germany foots the bill for Bulgaria's debt obligations, or there's a perception of instability at the point at which you have to pay more debt to be able to foot the bill on social services. That means that at the point where you're executing this policy, you analyze these economies robustly to determine a good median amount. I think it's very reasonable to be able to say that at the point where the euro risks having being a more unstable currency, and that means that it's harder for all EU nations to get trade, Germany will foot the bill on getting the best experts to do very robust analysis to make sure that there's minimal pullout happening. Second of all, there's likely to be complaints that can be heard and balanced out because the European Council discusses this in ways that they can try and balance out a variety of incentives, because obviously they want investment to come in, but they also want reasonable tax revenues. And also, I think they don't do this stupidly. You give apt notice and you tell companies that you're going to do this in advance in reasonable ways. The second important incentive here is that there's a large administrative cost if individual people in countries do not agree. This is things like local courts challenging you or doing individual instances of non-compliance when countries don't do effective collection. So you want to make sure that there's maximal assent. So you preemptively try to make sure that there's maximal cooperation and that you meet the incentives of a variety of nations, specifically the smaller nations, and make sure that there's not maximal capital flight. But also, third, there is an incentive to making sure you close the loopholes that opening opposition talk about. One, because obviously you need the money, but two, game theory. Everyone benefits from this tax revenue. All Dylan says here, note very carefully in your notes panel, is that people do this already. The issue is that there's a game theoretic incentive for you to be an outlier with your policy, because if it is not common, then you're always worried that somebody else will cheat and defect and increase their taxation rate, decrease their taxation rate first and be a tax haven. So you do it first because you don't want to be the one who gets fucked. Now, when everybody has a common policy and it is a commonly enforced one, very similar to tariffs at the WTO, this allows for you to be able to have this, and it means that people will not defect. That means that you will comply with the policy. But even if you don't believe that, there will be backlash from other member states if you do not comply. This means things like less money going towards helping to develop your infrastructure through the EU investment fund. This means things like less compliance to the point where you have legitimate complaints about things like the EU enforcing a ban on Russian imports of gas. What this means is that we're able to have this happen. Two important things to note about this analysis. First of all, opening government does not show you that the benefits of taxation can exist. This proves that it's plausible for the policy to happen at all in a way that is effective. But second of all, what this means is that second thing we're going to prove now is that investment will come into small EU states regardless, and this gives them lots of money. That's really important. First, why is it important that the EU does this? It's because smaller nations lack the social capital to be able to raise the taxation themselves, which is the importance of this policy for three reasons. First of all, these nations are remarkably over leveraged because of the fact that during COVID, they've been having to do things like providing businesses with support. They've been having to do things like provide people with things like gas subsidies during the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a massive gap left in their coffers as a result of the fact that these governments have been paying for things out of their own pocket as opposed to being able to rely on taxation revenues at the point where COVID shut everything down, at the point where the gas price and the grain price doubled. Second, and that means that these are overstretched further and further over time because high oil prices meant that they had to do things like additional gas subsidies because that affects every layer of your economy. It affects manufacturing, and it affects people's homes, and it affects the gas pump. Second, this is very unpopular, right? Business owners have a lot of power within the economy. They can lobby against your ability to do this. They can tell you why this is going to be bad. This is a more proximate incentive of, even if you don't believe that, this is the most proximate incentive of populations is to lower individual tax rates or to increase subsidies. So there will never be political capital to be popular. This in response to LO saying that leftist parties rise, because even if they do, they have to worry about putting food on the table as opposed to increasing corporate taxes. Third, there's a risk of businesses leaving capital flight. This is where we mobilize the one letter out of opening government that you prevent capital flight, because when everybody is the same rate, there's no comparative advantage to you going to one of the competitor nations. This disproves opening opposition because they tell you why there's incentives to be able to raise an individual corporate taxation rate in Bulgaria, but they never tell you why there's capacity to do so. The comparative to this is one, people cannot leave. There's no incentive for you to be able to do so because there's nowhere better for you to go. Second, the EU foots the political bill on this as a far more powerful actor. Right? Wait, I lost my notes. So that means that they're able to do this much more effectively. But finally, even if both can do this, it's better if we do it because it's a stronger government that is less vulnerable to lobbying and political interference, so they'll pass this at a fair and more impartial rate. Now, why does investment still exists when we do this taxation, and it does not just go off to the developing world? Because Nimai just says that you get more FDI, but it's unclear why there's a tipping point or an important thing. 4 reasons. 1, this is an entry point into the EU market that is cheaper with lower land costs, because you want to be able to trade within the EU. You want to be able to build factories that can go to Spain and Germany's markets. So you're able to enter the EU common market in a place that has lower land costs, which is why there's no incentive for you to like reshift your factories to India. Second of all, you have rapid development of sectors like the IT sector in Bulgaria and lithium mining in Slovenia, and these are growth opportunities with relative certainty that allows you to come in without thinking that you're going to lose your money. Before I give you the other 2 reasons, I'll take Dylan.
Yeah, so the whole point of our analysis is that it's like literally impossible to set a rate that helps everybody. So it doesn't matter how quickly you can change it or how much people care. It doesn't get things better for all countries.
That's fine. That's fine. So like, even if it isn't a rate that helps everyone, it's a rate that helps someone to some degree, everyone to some degree, as opposed to helping lots of people and fucking over some of them. So 3rd reason, other nations are oftentimes over-invested and that there's more competition in you investing with Germany because other people have gotten there first and gotten the comparative advantages. But also you get able to, relative to other developing nations, you have a lot more certainty of you having having specialized labor sectors and things like this. What this proves is that there's an increase in corporate tax, allows a lot more money to come into nations like Bulgaria for you to spend on social services. Why is this important? One, you fill the lacuna of social services. These nations have been fucked over in terms of them not having money. Now they have money that they can use to invest into big infrastructure projects where otherwise they could never raise this capital on the comparative. Second, you make yourself competitive again and you can leverage growth environments, which I think Dung will explain in weighing. Third, you have more money into the EU coffers that you can spend on things like common EU goods like climate change policy implementation or the carbon capture scheme. So 3 pieces of weighing. 1, unclear why small businesses matter. We feel opening government's metric because competition is better when big firms can come in, they want to come in, they can offer workers different jobs, compete for workers offering higher wages, or try to sell the same goods for a lower price. And the analysis to prove this is from us only. Second, welfare is the precondition to investment because you need a market that looks investable. When people are poor, they have little consumer power. They spend money on making rent and buying bread. When you're richer, you have consumer purchasing power, so businesses can come in and you have more skilled workers, which allows for this to exist. But finally, even if this fucks over big nations, small nations struggle to make money more, so therefore they're more important for us to prioritize. Vote closing government.
Thanking member of CAF, calling member of opposition.
Audible, right?
Yep, perfectly so.
Can at least one of the judges like turn on a camera so I don't speak to like the cold digital screen, if that's possible? Okay, Oisín, thank you. Really appreciate this. Starting in a second. What? I have a right to see faces. It's like an in-person tournament. Okay, just a sec. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The case from closing opposition is very simple. There are structural reasons as to why the tax is going to be excessively high. If it is excessively high, more money goes towards the government. We believe, comparatively, companies retaining more money are going to be using it more productively and more efficiently. Let's firstly prove why the tax is going to be artificially high. Secondly, why companies are better actors to productively use the money relative to the governments. I would just point one strategic thing that's like meta debating. We don't rely on race to the bottom or inefficiencies or loopholes. Our case is stronger with that. We want race to the bottom. We want companies to evade taxes. It's actually preferable for them to retain more money than the government getting money. Now, on to extension. The first thing that I want to prove is why is the European Union going to structurally increase the taxes excessively more? I would just like to present the factual status quo. Romania, 12%. Bulgaria, 10%. This is the status quo in Eastern Europe. What is the status quo in France? 26%, 28% in Germany, 22% in Italy, 26% in Spain. Why is this structurally two? There are 3 reasons as to why this is the case and why they have excessively high corporate taxes that are incompatible with Eastern Europe. The first reason is that the parties that are in power have a legacy of welfare states. That is to say, they secure their electorate and their primary identity is based on welfare politics. The second reason as to why this structurally happens is they cannot reverse the corporate tax, right? Because their welfare state is reliant on that. If they reverse it, people get upset because this is a privilege like universal healthcare or social spending that is taken away from them. People get very much more upset when a right or a privilege is taken away from them rather than them not having it all together. But thirdly, this is an existential necessity for them. They have welfare programs because they require migrants and other people to come because they have low birth rates and they require young workers that are attracted by those by those particular welfare programs. Now, we have proven an incentive as to why it's going to be excessively high. What are the capacity for them to do it? The first capacity is they're the most fucking populous. Italy, majority, like Spain, France, and Germany are the most populous. They have the most votes. But secondly, they're spending the most amount of money within the European Union. This is just a fact. Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania are on a deficit. They receive money from the European Union. They cannot backlash because there is some power asymmetry, because they are reliant on the funding in that particular way. What is the way with closing government? Everything they say is Sojak secondary incentive. You care about backlash, you care about the European Union, but you more proximately care about being re-elected within your own domestic country. They're out of the debate. What are the strategic implications of this? A, irrespective of everything else, when the tax rate gets increased, companies have to adjust. The most intuitive adjustment is to fire people, reduce their benefits, reduce their healthcare packages within Eastern Europe, because this is the most secure and also the most recurring and consistent cost that you have. This is a tangible impact that happens by virtue of the motion, irrespective of everything else. But let's move on to the second extension. Why are companies better actors compared to the government? I would just like to posit, this is stronger than opening opposition because we are saying that not only they have some incentives, but that they are structurally inefficient in the way in which they are distributing resources. So why is this structurally true? The first broad reason that I would posit is that companies have competition. That is to say, companies are competing domestically, but also internationally because they have branches in other countries. They cannot get excessively large because A, there are regulations that are preventing mergers within the European Union, or B, it just a finite amount of like monopolization that you can actively do because people enjoy certain types of brands and certain types of products and are not willing to change. This is why even the biggest giants like Amazon have competitors, Apple has competitors, and even huge oligopolies exist within a more tight monopolistic market, but there is still competition. Why does the government not have such competition? There are two reasons as to why this is the case. The first of which, specifically in the context of Eastern Europe, in many cases there is no viable political opposition because many parties are from the Communist Union and they have entrenched powers within the governments and they're able to retain onto power, or secondly, they just are like factually dominating the political landscape, like in Hungary, in Poland, in Bulgaria. They're currently dominant and they don't have politician, but opposition. But secondly, many posts in the government don't have politician because they're not competition because they're not up for election. That is to say, technocratical posts are like in committees, in executive posts, they don't have competition. But let's bite the bullet. There is competition to some degree. Why is competition within the government harmful? Firstly, politicians have a more proximate incentive to get re-elected, thus they're much more short-termistic, which is problematic. Secondly, in many cases, when there's an excess of money that you receive from corporate taxes, you're more likely to invest in companies that are funding your own operations and are actively giving good donations during the election cycle, meaning they favor local and national monopolies and are actively stifling competition. The second way in which companies are preferable to the government on euro-to-euro basis is incentives. Companies, firstly, are not racist and are highly ethical. Why is this the case? A, they have no fucking reason to discriminate because as long as you can work and are productive, they don't care about discriminating you. But secondly, in many cases, this could actively hurt their image because if they're actively racist, this hurts their PR, this hurts their shareholder balance. This actively means they're more likely to lose customers because customers tend to be morally conscious, meaning they have no reason to be racist. Before I continue, I'll take a point from opening. Yes.
Yeah, we proved that in status quo, you're double taxed for the country that you earn your money and your residence. That's a huge administrative and compliance burden for the big companies that you care about for investment and trade across borders.
But it's comparative. They're going to be getting much less money if you are taxing them with 15% more compared to that small thingy. Secondly, companies care about poor people. Why is this structurally true? The first reason is that if they don't have employment, this actively means that you can pay them lower wages and you can hire more of them. And secondly, if you are their primary source of income, you create long-term loyalty, which means they're not hopping around different jobs, which increases productivity, but also makes you much more likely to retain them and to save on operational costs for hiring other people. Why are Eastern European governments comparatively less so inclusive? Firstly, politicians have electoral incentives to fearmonger against minorities like Roman people in Bulgaria and Romania, against migrants and other people. Secondly, if the region isn't part of the dominant political party, they don't have an incentive to actively fund that particular region. Or thirdly, they don't care about poor people because poor people are not voting. Thus, they're worthless to them. Meaning, comparatively, we would prefer a world in which more people are employed by companies and are not dependent by the government because the government is highly bureaucratic and selective in who it favors. So, on all those grounds, oppose.
Thinking member Gov, calling Gavit. Member up, calling Gavit.
Yep. Hopefully I'm audible. I'll take a PI from opening. Just put it in the chat. Before I start, I need to take a bathroom break. I'll be back in like 5 seconds. Uh, I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First off, I just want to get this assumption that businesses probably spend money better than the government, because that sort of also bites into our impact. Firstly, I'll tell you why governments just spend money better on people and why they probably give better welfare. Before I start my analysis, I just want you to gut check this, right? Like, when was the last time you saw Amazon give welfare or give handouts? It's probably the case that governments are the ones who are likely to help poor people. But even if you don't believe me, I'll still give you reasons as to why the governments are better at doing this. There's 3 unique reasons as to why governments are probably good at doing welfare. The first one is that just on information. Even if either side are malevolent actors, I want to posit that the government comparatively has more information on what type of people need the money in the first place. So even if on either side there's corrupt incentives, governments probably know where to spend the little amount of money that's being given to the poor, insofar as they literally can do things like survey, insofar as they literally, the government, so they have things like bureaus who go out and do investigations. And so therefore the money that actually gets spent is probably more comparative and helping people that needs it the most. Secondarily, on an incentive level, I just want to tell it that like companies probably just want to benefit their shareholders. Like, just intuitively, they probably don't care as much about poor people. So what are the rebuttals we got against this coming from CEO? The first preemption they give is that they care about poor people because poor people buy into the services of these companies. Firstly, I'm not sure why this suddenly means that they want to give money to these poor people, insofar as if you give money to these poor people, it doesn't guarantee that they go back and buy your services. If anything, they can probably go to your competitors. So it's not the most certain thing for you to up these poor people. But secondarily, I'm just not sure why they care about poor people in the first place, insofar as they probably don't benefit the company. I.e., these are people who are unskilled. These are people who probably have a variety of other issues in their lives, which means they can't commit as an employee because they, for instance, might have to pay a sick day because they can't pay hospital bills. For instance, they just have a broken family, so they have to attend to that. So insofar as this is the case, I'm not sure what the marginal returns they have to cater to the poor is, even in this debate. And so therefore, they probably don't care about spending money on the poor in the third place. But thirdly, I just think structurally, a lot of these companies probably are going to position their places in areas that are relatively high income, insofar as the most, like, the richest company probably are things like tech, or things like, I don't know, processing, and they probably are going to be in places that are a lot more higher skilled workers, because, or like places like university, which means that the trickle down benefits of them, for instance, building infrastructure and shit, or building ports, probably aren't going to help the poor either. But like, even these infrastructures, I'm not sure how they help poor people either. The second layer of response they give is, but like, companies are at least not racist. Firstly, just gut check this claim. This probably is untrue for 2 reasons. The first one is that often a lot of these people probably have very conservative shareholders. Insofar as conservative people probably have been there for very long, like, so they are able to accumulate money. And so therefore, they often just rise to the top and they're able to make important decisions. But secondarily, a lot of these companies are very risk averse. Insofar as, for instance, Xbox doesn't even want to show the gay flag because it might get banned in like Saudi Arabia. They probably want to cater to a variety of markets around the world. And so therefore, they want to cater to the lowest denominator in terms of human rights. They want to cater to the shittiest human rights like platform possible, because they fear that they might get secluded from other markets. And so therefore, they probably are going to not have the greatest human rights track records compared to like government. But thirdly, in terms of what type of incentives matter, because the types of incentives, like the pressure coming from, for instance, minorities, probably doesn't affect shareholders, because I'm not sure why, like, definitionally, these shareholders care about minorities, insofar as they probably spend a lot less money on their products, whereas they can probably put some money in, like, pressure on the government through things like, I don't know, like pressure, like lobbying or pressure on the streets, whereas shareholders probably don't have information to this, insofar as minorities are probably less likely to make it to the meeting boards in the first place to inject it with discussion. So why do we probably give better money for the poor then, irregardless of all of this, if you don't buy my rebuttals? The first reason is that just on scale, we also just help jobless people, i.e. maybe a lot of these people are laid off, but I'm not sure why these people matter more than the scale of benefits provided by welfare, i.e. every single person is benefited on our side, whereas on their side, you need to get a job in order to get things like benefits from these companies, or things like wages, or things like healthcare. But secondarily, on intensity, often the poorest people just don't get access to a lot of these benefits. They aren't able to access jobs for the very reasons I said, and so therefore, we help these poor people by giving them welfare. Last reason, just international pressure. There's significantly more international scrutiny on these people, on these countries inside of the EU, because they can face like sanctions in things like the European Council. They can probably face a lot of pressure from the European Parliament and stuff as well, because insofar as they probably need to participate in the system, they also want handouts from the EU, so they probably are going to comply with the EU and not fuck over poor people. So that's CEO completely out of the debate. Let's take OO then. What did we get coming from them? The first thing they said is that I asked Diallo what the impact was. Before I get on, sure, you want.
Yeah, so regardless of which back half team is right about their characterization, we still get massive impacts of economic stagnation, therefore job loss, stresses on health and welfare systems, decreased quality of life, disproportionately affecting poor people and poor countries as well.
Right, great. So the thing I was going to say is that I asked Diallo what the impact was, and they said you can adjust the shock, and then Dylan added those impacts. So firstly, let's just address what was actually said in the speeches, because I had more time to write rebuttals for that. So I'll just say them anyways. The first reason as to why I probably want to weigh off the worst excess of their case, as to why shocks probably won't happen to a lot of people, are two reasons. The first one is often you are in the same currency and trade union, so therefore if one country stagnates, all other countries stagnate, and so therefore often shocks align. And so therefore, countries have the same incentive to tackle shocks at the same time. And so therefore, you probably aren't going to leave any other country out. But secondarily, I also want to know that you have incentives to help smaller countries because of the reason I said before, you're an interlinked community. And so therefore, you're more likely to give them aid insofar as if they also are poor, they drag the currency down and it fucks the entire region. But thirdly, I also want to posit that they didn't explain to you why social capital accrues for you to change even in the first place, because their case is premised on these countries being left alone and being able to change the rate in a way that is good. But know that a lot of the regions that Wajeeh give explain to you why these tax rates can't be changed in a way that's beneficial. Because, for instance, there's significant backlash from lobbyists. Or for instance, this is not a core issue inside of elections, and so therefore you actually never get the chance to bring it up. Or for instance, the results that come from taxes often accrue very few years, like a few years later, or like a year later, insofar as these things are economics and it takes a lot of time to eventuate. And so therefore, as a government, you don't get the social capital benefits from actually changing the tax rate in the first place. It's very not visible. And so therefore, you don't care about the taxes. And so therefore, you just need a lot of time, just need a lot of social capital, which doesn't explain as to how it accrues. So therefore, they can't get tax changes on the first place. Second layer on capacity. Even if you don't buy all of this incentive stuff, I'll tell you why there's still capacity for you to tackle shocks in the status quo. The first reason is that often there's just a lot of precedent to bail out countries after COVID, i.e. things like Next Generation Fund, where the EU borrowed like $800 billion or euros, I forgot, of the common market in order to, through like bonds, which means that they can just give money to these poor countries. But secondarily, know that all of our case increases the capacity for these countries to insulate themselves from shock, i.e. at the point at which they're able to get more money from things like corporate taxes. Know that a lot of these smaller countries don't have the social capital to raise taxes on corporates in the first place, because Bulgaria, or like insert other poorer country, is probably what's the word? They don't have the they are vulnerable to they're vulnerable to corporate capture because they probably aren't as strong to resist these corporations, and so therefore they probably can't raise taxes. Whereas on our side we allow this, and so therefore they get money to shelter themselves from shock. All these reasons, very proud to.
Thanking Whip, calling on opposition Whip.
Hi, I presume you hear me.
Yep.
Cool. POIs in chat, I'll take one from opening and I'll start in just a sec. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. You all go give Bulgaria as an example, but you don't know shit about Bulgaria. Since the fall of the communistic regime, we have had a flat tax of 10%, and that's the only way we've been able to acquire any business whatsoever, such as Uber, such as Accenture, HP, whatever the fuck you want. Now, let's firstly respond to CG, compared to O, and then rebut OG. Firstly, on CG. One, the very important characterization that we need to determine is how this tax look like. That's why it was smart for Dylan to ask this, but I don't think anybody provided an answer to what it's likely to look like except back half. However, let's compare the analysis we have of both teams. CG says this will be done because you're dependent on Bulgaria, whatever the fuck other country, because your economy is tied to there. What Biser tells you is more important than that. Germany, sure, cares for its economic ties with Bulgaria, even though they don't trade as much. But what's more important is if internally people are happy with the regime, because you know what? Europe diplomats are voted in by the Germans. And if Germans are having less welfare programs, because supposedly the tax is not as high, right? Maybe you give it to 15%, which Germany right now has like a 23% one, meaning there's a huge decrease in the money the government has in order to spend on welfare policy. You become hugely unpopular within your own nation. That's why the big nations that have the most money and are most populous are likely going to shift the discussions on how this tax will look like to be higher than that, because otherwise they have a lot more to lose domestically as opposed to the ambiguous international ties they have with some other countries, which I'm not sure why you cannot replace otherwise in terms of trade. But secondly, and I want to point this out, our case is not necessarily dependent that your economy crashes or that developing countries are fucked. It's more so that individuals on the ground are not able to receive money from their jobs because the government is not able to give handouts. It's not able to give social security because it is racist and it's bureaucratic, and the help will come too late to the point which people are already starving. Corporations have better incentives regardless of that. Secondly, though, there are reasons as to why you want to increase the taxes are very funny to me, because Bulgaria hasn't wanted to increase its taxes for 23 years. I don't know why it will start now, but let's be more constructive than that, because I know the Bulgaria card doesn't just generally work. One, they say, but you spend a lot of money during COVID, therefore you need a lot of money right now to compensate for that. That's unrealistic though, because during COVID you received huge EU packages upon this, right? You received so much subsidy by international governments, by many international institutions that wanted globally people to limit the spread of COVID, therefore they had an incentive to give you this money. However, point this out, if you raise the taxes likely on the developing countries, all corporations within the nation have higher taxes. This is not just international corporations, it's the domestic corporations that are struggling to survive during COVID. So do you know what? You're actually making it worse economically for those countries, especially because when you have less money as a corporations, there are two routes you can take. Either one, you lay off workers because you cannot afford to pay them anymore, or two, in the best case of government side, you don't lay them off, but you take away their healthcare benefits, their sick days, their vacation days, and you exploit them way more comparatively. Or worse off, you raise your taxes, your prices as the corporation. This harms every single individual within this country, because everyone has to buy those products. If they're higher, this means that every individual has less of a purchasing power to afford things such as medicine that are more expensive and more essential to your life. So no, I don't think those countries need higher taxes, but what we prove comparatively is the following. Even if we buy the correct framing from CG and say, yes, those countries need money, but it's not necessarily the country, it's the people that need this money. We prove, even if you buy their framing, that on our side, you're better able to access people on the ground and give them the help that they need. What does this look like? We provide to you many mechanisms that they somewhat are, but somewhat not. They say, but governments are not racist, they care for poor people, blah, blah, blah. This does not engage with our competing analysis on why poor people, for example, don't vote as much, therefore they are not someone who the government cares about. However, companies want cheap labor, therefore they're willing to, for example, what Google and Amazon did is to fund the internet campaigns in different countries so that people can become customers and later on either work for them or just pay the prices for them. But secondly, note that even if you presume the best incentives of governments, which you should refer to Biser's speech to see otherwise, this is not comparative, because governments are just slower in giving you money. Even if you presume they can give you handouts and social security, this comes at a slower pace than your wage as a worker in the corporation. If those corporations have a capacity to hire less people, more people don't have money for food, for all those things. And all the other things such as governments are short-termistic, or that they're polarizing because they win based on marginalizing different minorities, are all things that the most vulnerable people within those countries are fucked indefinitely, and they don't provide any solvency towards that. Secondly, positioning our extension towards OO. One, note that our analysis will explain why it is likely that the income tax will be higher, not just saying it will be 21.5%, is determinant to their case. Why? Because all their impacts of you not being able to handling a crisis, you not being able to have a lot of businesses, depends on there being a big between the tax that was before and the tax there will be now. They never give you reasons as to why this is likely. We feel this crucial gap for them. But certainly, not all of their impacts about why you're able to deal with the crisis now, because you are able to have more flexible policy, is questioned by gov teams, such as there are other ways you can do this, such as raise the interest rate or increase other taxes, such as the individual tax. What we provide to you though is explain, if people are wealthier because they have a wage, because they have a job, because they have healthcare benefits and are overworked, this is a better way to fix economic crises because you have a purchasing power. But before that, OG.
Investment from companies is easily retracted and inequitable in the pockets of CU lobbyists anyways. OG's cross-border clarity and stability is a better form of long-term investment.
Sure. culture, you don't prove this. But I will get with you as I asked in a POI. One, small corporations cannot develop on their side comparatively to large corporations. Why is this the case? One, they have a lack of know-how. They don't know how to manage people efficiently because they haven't had the experience that large corporations had. We prefer for the large corporations to exist there. But secondly, you cannot produce it at economies of scale, meaning you're too big to the cost that you produce. Therefore, you raise the prices for every single individual within these companies. Now, even if you care for small companies, it's better on their side, on our side of the house. Do you know why? Because they have more money to operate with. If you raise the tax, these taxes, the small corporations that cannot afford those taxes, they either go bankrupt or they just are not able to do any innovation because they have no money left whatsoever in access. Comparatively, innovation and all of those nice things are done when a corporation has an excess amount of money, which happens when you have a lower tax on them, so they can have more innovation, more workers, and more benefits. Clear, CEO.
Thank you, Ingvar. With that, we come to
Guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.